Hi guys, another short video on useful CB radio and maybe ham radio as well. Repair aids. We're going with multimeters this time. So you don't need an expensive multimeter. Just cheap one like this would do, or maybe cheap ones you can pick up from Aldi and Lidl sometimes, because they sometimes sell them as well. They're perfectly acceptable for the job. You don't really need an expensive one like a Fluke or the reliable and well-known and well-renowned Avo 8. So, just a cheap one like this will do, because it will give you the result that you want. So, use it to check things like whether the speaker's working or not. So if you're getting no sound out of the speaker, it's worth checking that. You just use the ohms setting, put the test leads across the speaker. It should read whatever's stamped on the speaker, which is 8 or 16 ohms. And if it doesn't read that, then the speaker's probably open circuit. I think you can do that with microphones as well, same sort of thing. Microphones, I think they're about 600 ohms in most cases, not all. So, you could also use that to check the VCO, because there's usually a specific voltage it needs to be on transmit and receive, and it also aids with adjusting it as well. So, that's where it could be useful. And also, if you're not getting power to the radio at all, you can use the voltage setting to check whether voltage is actually getting to the radio. And if it isn't, you can also, if it's not immediately obvious, because it might not be, put the meter onto the continuity setting as shown here and check across the fuse. And if the fuse doesn't show anything, then the fuse is blown. So that's a good use of it. I'm not going to go into too much depth on this. Like I said, voltage. It can also be used to see how much current a radio is drawing, as long as it's within the capabilities and range of the meter. What you would do is you would put this into, on transmit anyway, you'd put it into the 20 amp setting, because most radios on transmit are usually an amp or more, and we'd put that into DC amp setting, 20 amps, and you'd put that between the radio and the power supply, and it would come up with the current draw on receive, and when you press transmit it would come up with the current draw on transmit. So that would also give you an idea of whether the transmitter's actually doing anything if you haven't got a power meter connected to check the transmit output power, because if it's quite low, chances are it's not transmitting. So, always worth looking at that. So, let's put that back into the volts and ohms setting, because something I best point out is that if you leave it in the current setting, the meter becomes a dead short circuit, and it might go bang if you put it across something, or something else might go bang. So, not ideal, but make sure, keep the test leads in that setting unless you need to measure current. This one can do a few other things as well, can measure capacitance as well, but I don't think that's too accurate. There is a capacitance setting on here. It can measure transistors as well, make sure they're working. So, this one can do exactly the same. This is a slightly more expensive meter, and it's actually older than that one. Yeah, I got this one at the Blackpool rally this year. I think I paid about 10 quid for it. This I've had for a few years, and I bought it from Maplin for probably about 30 quid. So, still cheap, but not that cheap, if you know what I mean. And I have another multimeter about somewhere. It's not immediately to hand right now. Really cheap one. I think it cost me about a £5 at the time. It's not the most reliable. It's a really dinky little thing. So I'm not sure where that is at the moment. So that's multimeters. I'm not going to go into too much detail. It might be worth me giving a practical demonstration, so I'm just going to pause the video while I try and set that up. Okay, so I've got the meter just over here. This is the cheap one I decided I'd use for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a practical example. See if I can bring this in. Might not focus right. So I'm going to measure across that speaker. So, if I was to measure across that speaker and I wasn't getting anything, then that speaker's probably open circuit. But I know it's an 8 ohm speaker. It's a half a watt speaker as well, according to the stamp on the back. So I should, in theory, there we go, 8 ohms. If I wasn't getting anything, then that speaker would be open circuit. There we go. 8 ohms. And that's just me putting the test leads across the speaker. Another way I could do that is this speaker's got a jack plug on it. Put it across that as well. Might show some extra resistance doing that. Shows 10 ohms doing that. So I think there's some resistance in this lead. Actually showing some rather odd values, but I think it might be someone else screwing that up. So that's me putting it across there. That's kind of interesting. Try the other way. So I had the negative on the tip, which is probably not the best place to have it. Yeah, I think there might be some resistance in that lead. There's also a screw stuck to it, which is not really very helpful because I think that's a screw out of the Team Road Com FS, because I've not screwed the lid back down on that after doing the video on the internal adjustments inside that. So that's one useful thing. So I'm just going to turn the power supply on. I have to go under the bench to do that. And I'm going to turn everything on, including my printer, which is very annoying. And I'm going to set this to DC volts, which to measure a CB power supply has to be the 20 volts DC, because a CB radio power supply or an amateur radio power supply is usually 13.8 volts. This one's variable, but it is set at 13.8 volts. Do excuse the printer making a noise because I've just turned the power to the wall socket on. So, if you're not getting any power to your CB radio, you can first check the power supply. That power supply is 13.85 volts, which is ideal. So, I know that's working. I haven't got a power lead for a CB to test hand. I did have the one for the Team Road Com, but that isn't actually plugged in at the moment. I'll need to find the other end of that. So I could plug that in because I've put a power pole to cigarette lighter plug lead to it. Although, having said that, I have actually spotted something else I could try. So I've got this cigarette lighter plug, which on the other end connects to the Thunderpole T600. Now I know that works, so I'm just going to unplug it. I'm going to plug that into the cigarette lighter socket on the power supply. And then what I'm going to do with this end is I'm going to put the test leads into that, because that will also help identify the polarity. If I can get both prods in there, because they're quite closely spaced. These are actually very closely spaced. Yeah, there isn't a lot of room in there. Oh. Did have the reading. There we go. So I know that power lead's working and none of the fuses have blown. So all I did was I took this end and I put the test prods in there. It was quite difficult to do. So if I put them in the other way around and I get a negative, it means that the negative leads in the positive and the positive leads in the negative. Like I said, these are actually quite close together, so it's actually quite difficult to do that. But I know it works because I've just tried it and you've just seen the voltage. Yes, I'll unplug that. So now I shouldn't get anything on that. Let's put the cover back over the cigarette lighter socket on that power supply. Power supply in question is a Mydel one from Martin Lynch & Sons. I got it as a freebie with my Yaesu FT991A, because at the time they were doing a deal throwing in the power supply with the radio, which was actually good because then I didn't have to spend extra money on a power supply and needed a new supply in here anyway, because the Maplin one that I've got just wasn't really adequate for what I need, and obviously it didn't have the cigarette lighter plug on it and I had to build a rather crude adapter for that. But it's ample enough to drive a CB, and it certainly would drive a little bit more than that. It would drive my 991A at full power without problem. So it's actually pretty useful, and it's 13.8 volts, so that's what I need when I'm actually doing tune-ups on the radios. such as the Uniden UniAce 100 that I'm working on, which is actually sat on top of the supply at the moment. So, hopefully I'll get that done, because this week I should be able to buy some tools to finish the job. So, that's multimeters. And just a couple of brief demonstrations on what you can do with them. So, it's Paul, Mike 0, Whiskey November, Uniform All 26 Charlie Tango 730 if you catch me on 11 metres, and PMR 446, or just the red squirrel on the old CB if you like. So, always good to buy a multimeter, don't have to buy an expensive one, and these cheap ones will do exactly what the big Flukes and Avo 8s will do. Might be slight discrepancies on the readings between the more expensive meters, but it still gives you an indication of what's what. So, 7.3 for now, and I'll catch you in the next video.